Vi har lagt bak oss en hektisk uke i internasjonal klimapolitikk, og i dag er vi så heldige å ha med oss Victoria Cuming, som er leder for global politikk hos analysebyrået BloombergNEF. Derfor er denne podcasten på engelsk. Det tror jeg kommer til å gå helt fint, og med det så ønsker jeg velkommen til en ny episode av Energi og Klima. Today we are delighted to have with us Victoria Cuming, Head of Global Policy at BloombergNEF. Welcome to us, Victoria.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to spend the majority of our time looking ahead to Glasgow and the COP26, and what we know today will be the main topics there. But I would like to start off by looking back at last week. What are your initial reactions to the US-led Leaders Climate Summit that was held the previous Thursday and Friday, and where the US made a new pledge of 50 to 52% emission reductions by 2030 compared to 2005?
So I guess the last week's summit had two main goals. The first one was for the US to start rebuilding its credibility as a climate leader. So it's now back in Paris, and so it was an attempt for the US to say, hello, we're back in the room, we're fully committed to tackling climate change. But it was also meant to galvanize the efforts of other countries as well. So to say, hello, we're back in the room, and we've put forward our new, more ambitious targets. And so this is a way of encouraging other governments to follow suit. So we say that it was partly successful. It's kind of, the US is now kind of back on the path to rebuilding its credibility. The new target is a significant increase in ambition. So if we looked at it, that if they had just increased or rather maintained the same level of ambition as their 2025 target, they'd have announced a 2030 target of something like 38%. But instead, it was this 50 to 52%. There is a question, however, which we could get onto, of like whether how achievable that target is and what it needs to do now to actually realize it and to fully rebuild its credibility. So I guess it's partly successful in the first goal. And on the second, we saw each government made more commitments, but they weren't necessarily all an increase in ambition in terms of their headline NDC emission reduction target, except for two main economies. So that was Canada and Japan. So somewhat successful on both counts, we could say.
Something I find a bit complicated, and that is to compare climate pledges. I mean, if we just look at last week, the US compare with 2005 as their base year. Norway and the European Union used 1990 as their base case, and I saw that Japan was actually using 2013, and it makes it a bit difficult to get a clear picture and be able to compare all these different pledges, doesn't it?
It is. It's very easy to get confused. And that was one of the reasons why we've written this new report comparing the G20's NDC targets. And we've also published now an update based on the announcements that were made last week's summit. And so essentially governments are free to structure their NDC targets as they like. So they use different baselines, different deadlines, kind of different scope. So our report wasn't an attempt to compare the G20. So we looked first of all at the change in absolute volumes from 2010 to 2030, the change in emission intensity, because some, especially emerging economies, like to look at it in terms of emissions per unit of GDP, looked at emissions per capita. And we also looked at the what emissions would be if the target was met and what emissions are due to be without the target, and the gap between those as a kind of indicator of what the required abatement was. So, and base years is one of the crucial things that, and the difference in base year does make it very difficult to compare these targets. And countries choose the base year that suits them for whatever purpose. So in the case of the US, one of the reasons why the US and Australia and Canada have chosen a later base year is because that allowed emissions to go up. They allowed a bit longer time in order for emissions to increase. We looked at the the difference in reductions, depending on the base year for all of the countries of the G20, and found that those who have targets based on a base year, they've all chosen the one that would have the biggest percentage change. So in practice, it doesn't actually mean a difference in the effort required, but it can look much better in terms of negotiating if you can give a bigger percentage change. So the headline's better.
Something I noticed in the report that you mentioned was how several large emitting nations, I think you mentioned China and Turkey specifically, can increase their emissions and still meet their 2030 targets. Could you elaborate a bit on that?
In the case of China, if you look at both the change in absolute volumes of emissions from 2010 to 2030, they can almost double their emissions. But also if you look at for several economies, including China, but also Canada, they could still increase their emissions from 2018, but meet their target. And that kind of gives an indication of the level of ambition of that target. So while I said earlier, the US, it was a kind of marked increase in ambition, its new target. For Canada, it was less so.
Before moving on to the COP26 in Glasgow, at BloombergNEF, you've created an aggregated country score among the G20 countries to sort of keep score of who's having the most ambitious targets. Who's currently leading the way?
So it's the UK and EU, and now also the US are the top three. The EU and UK, it's less of a surprise because they've really sought to establish themselves as climate leaders. I think what I should say, and this is the case for the US, but also the European countries, this is just looking at the level of ambition of their targets, not necessarily whether they'll achieve them, and certainly whether they have the policies in place to do so.
When I read climate scenarios, whether it's from BloombergNEF, the International Energy Agency, or others, they usually have different scenarios with a business as usual scenario, with currently implemented policies, and then with NDC policies already implemented, even though they're not politically decided on. So I'm just wondering, how large is the gap between sort of implemented policies and where we need to be?
It's a good question. So in theory, by 2035, if Biden achieves his ambition to have decarbonized the power system by then, that's less of a concern. But the main concern is the rest of the economy, specifically industry. So at the beginning of this year, BloombergNEF published a report called the Zero Carbon Policy Scoreboard. And that looked at actually the decarbonization policies that countries have put in place. And in the case of the US, this looked at both federal and state level policy. And the US is particularly weak on industrial policy to promote kind of energy efficiency, but also switching to cleaner fuels. And so would have to see some kind of transformation, essentially, in the economy of the US if it wants to achieve its the 50% target by 2030. And it could be fairly challenging for Biden to put in place those policies. He would have to start work now, because I think one thing that people underestimate is how long it takes to develop policies, then to actually put them and pass them through the required political process, and then for those policies to be implemented and to take effect. And for example, in industry, we're talking about assets that have useful lives of decades. So it's actually it's a long process to get the policy in place and to actually reduce emissions. So I was going to say that, so in the case of the US, yes, there is a particularly kind of big policy implementation gap, we would say. But for some countries and parties, there's less of a gap, say like the UK and the EU. They've taken more steps to put in place concrete policies. But even say that the UK, it's particularly weak in terms of building policies, as in policies for buildings, and particularly on the heating side. So that's an area that it would need to focus on. And all of these countries would also need to look at an area that's often forgotten, which is agriculture, which accounts for a sizable amount of emissions, and in some cases, like for example Brazil, a huge share of national emissions.
The meeting in Glasgow is the 26th UN climate conference. And even though there's been several conferences since Paris in 2015, I keep reading that the Glasgow meeting it's coined as the most important since Paris. How is that?
Well, one of the reasons is that we're at a crucial stage within the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So we're really kicking off the first pledging and reporting cycle for these nationally determined contributions, NDC climate plans. And so the idea was that parties were meant to restate or update their climate plans before COP26. And it would give an indication of what those pledges were, the kind of level of ambition, and whether any of those parties have actually increased ambition since Paris was signed. And so that kicks off, that's the kind of first step in this cycle. And then the next step comes in 2023, when we have this assessment of the global ambition, this global stocktake, with the view to parties then going away and then ratcheting up their climate ambition in their next NDCs. So it will COP26 will give an indication of how that process is working. It also will have been 2 years since we had a COP, and there's always far too much to actually agree and to be achieved within the space. So there's a lot of important things on the agenda, and not least the question of finance, because, as I'm sure you're aware, 2020 was the deadline for developed countries to be supplying or mobilizing, to use the UNFCCC lingo, 100 billion a year.
How do you see the potential divide between developing and developed countries playing out? You already mentioned climate finance, and if you look at the sort of emission depth burden the US have emitted, I can't remember the exact percentage of total global emissions, but
it's about a quarter, yeah.
Do you see a sharper division between those two groups of countries in the upcoming negotiations?
I think the divide between developing and developed country parties will certainly reappear at COP. It was mentioned by various political leaders last week, and it typically is raised. In terms of the Paris Agreement, that obliges the developed countries to various responsibilities, such as providing financial support, but also other kinds of more technical support, practical support to developing countries. And so I would expect it will certainly reappear in the talks, yes.
Besides finance, which areas do you see at the top of the agenda in Glasgow?
Well, we're not expecting Glasgow to be the new Paris, let's say. We're not expecting some kind of all-encompassing new global deal with new targets. But what we are expecting to see is, or hoping to see, let's put it that way, some kind of tangible progress on specific issues. So the UK government has said that it has various priorities, and the areas where we see most momentum is on the energy transition, so the move to clean power, a clean road transport, and we would also expect some kind of an agreement on finance. So whether it's some kind of new targets for 2025 for developed countries. So those are the areas where we expect to see most progress.
What about steps towards a global carbon market?
Yes. So Article 6, the discussions, we kind of see COP26 as a make or break, really, for Article 6 negotiations, because agreement is meant to be reached in several COPs, and it hasn't. There are still some issues that are holding an agreement back. We would hope to see some progress to be made, but if not, we would expect parties to go away, and we start to see more, say, bilateral deals of new schemes, which seems less effective way of doing it, but at least that would be some progress towards it.
I'm interested and intrigued by the geopolitical aspect of climate policy. just before the Climate Leaders Summit, China and the US agreed on a few principles working together against climate change. And then just after the summit was over, a Chinese spokesperson said that the US really have to prove that they're in the game, referencing how the country previously have opted out of both the Kyoto and the Paris Agreement. How do you see the relationship between US and China going forward? I know it's a massive question, but do you have any initial thoughts?
It's a difficult question. It's a huge topic. Yes. I think what's fair to say is that for the good of the planet, we would hope that one area of cooperation we would see between the US and China is how to deal with climate change. Both China and the US at the moment are committed to tackling it. So we could hope that this will be one area of collaboration. And the joint statement that they released last week did indicate that would be the case, leaving aside any issues we have over trade or supply chain issues. But I can see why China was talking about the US needing to walk the talk, because the US, it's all very well coming forward with a new target, because in some respects that's the easy bit. The difficult bit is actually for them to putting in place the policies to achieve those targets and then actually decarbonising and reaching it.
We have about 6 months to go until the COP26 in Glasgow, and there's a number of climate summits in the near future. Already next week, there's a meeting in Germany, the Petersberg Summit. Is there anything that you would like to see be in place before Glasgow in order to make it a success, or a country who has to put forward a new NDC ahead of Glasgow?
I think what would be helpful is if parties were clear, and really the UK government as host can play a role in leading this. They decide on what their priorities are, because and have specific goals for what COP at the end of the year should achieve, and then work backwards to look at the opportunities where they can discuss those. So they've now got a new negotiating event in May-June time. So to make best use of those opportunities, so that really when we get to COP, the nitty-gritty has been gone through and the details have been decided, and it's a question of hopefully signing on the dotted line. We could see some more announcements come out when we have the G7 and G20 meetings. In terms of major economies, one of the ones that hasn't, say, made a net zero target announcement is India, but we're not expecting them to do so, certainly not before COP. Same as that applies for Australia, but for different reasons. We could see, say, out of G20 or G7 meetings, announcements come out of making use of existing mechanisms like, say, the Powering Past Coal Alliance. So we could see more announcements for countries around phasing out coal power or investment in coal-fired power abroad, or, say, phasing out ICE vehicles.
A country that I'm actually a bit curious of is Russia. I know they have an emission target using 1990 as a base year, which was one of the last years of communist Soviet Union. I'm not quite sure whether that's the best year to compare against. I think it's quite preferable for Russia. But what do we actually know about their climate work going forward?
So we haven't seen any sign of Russia changing its target. Its NDC target, and we don't expect it to do so before Glasgow. It's not the most ambitious target in the G20, and as you say, it does somewhat conveniently use 1990 as the base year. I believe the government are working on some kind of climate law at the moment, but I'm not sure quite how pervasive or comprehensive or how effective it would be. In terms of the policies they have in place for decarbonisation, it's limited. So in the power sector, they have an auction scheme, but that is fairly limited, and it's particularly limited because of quite stringent local content requirements that are put in place that reduce participation. And outside of the power sector, there is very little zero carbon policy, low carbon policy.
We're nearing the end, Victoria. In your view, what would be the best case outcome of the Glasgow meeting?
Best case outcome. For me, I think the best case outcome would be that we would see a significant show of, or a significant commitment to specific areas. So, for example, to coal power. So let's say no more investment in coal-fired power, whether domestically or abroad. We would also see some kind of an agreement on financing, because that's a crucial element of the crucial piece of the puzzle. And as it's this kind of optimistically best case out, there would be some kind of agreement on the Article 6 market mechanisms to make use of those, because it seems somewhat of a wasted opportunity if we have another COP and there's still no agreement on how to take that forward.
Do you think Boris Johnson is looking at the COP26 as a potential highlight of his political career?
I think that... Well, I think the UK government are certainly looking at it as being a positive event in, say, the last few years, which, as we're sure aware, has been somewhat tumultuous.
Thank you very much for joining us, Victoria, and sharing your knowledge and insight.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Energy and Climate. We'll be back sometime next week.